The wind screamed like a banshee straight out of hell that winter of 1883, whipping snow into my face as if the devil himself was trying to blind me. I clung to that frozen letter in my gloved hands. The ink smudged, but the words burned into my memory. Promises of a new life, a warm hearth, and a man who'd see me for more than just a shadow in someone else's story. The stagecoach lurched violently on the icy trail to Dusty Hollow, Montana, wheels skidding like they were dancing on the edge of a knife. My heart hammered against my ribs, not just from the cold seeping through my wool coat, but from the fear that this wild gamble might end me before it even began. Dreams out here could freeze solid in a heartbeat or burst into flames that consumed everything. And right then, with the blizzard raging like a wounded beast, I wasn't sure which fate awaited me. I am Amelia Rose Harper, or at least that's who I was back then. A woman forged in the fires of hardship, not some delicate prairie flower that wilted at the first frost. No, I was more like a towering sunflower, roots digging deep into rocky soil, head held high against the gales that tried to bend me. Back in the cramped tenements of Chicago, where the air stank of coal smoke and despair, I'd scraped by as a seamstress, mending dresses for ladies who looked through me like I was yesterday's news. But that letter from Ezekiel Hayes changed everything. He was a rugged rancher from Dusty Hollow, his words scrawled in a hand that spoke of calluses and long days under the sun. He promised a homestead, a partnership, a heart to share the burdens with. "I need a woman strong enough to stand beside me," he'd written, "not one who hides from the storm." For the first time in my weary 25 years, I felt seen, like maybe I wasn't too tall, too outspoken, too much for this world. With hope stitched into every fiber of my soul, I sold what little I had. My trusty sewing kit with its needles worn smooth from endless nights, Ma's chipped china that still carried the faint scent of her rosewater, even the lace curtains I'd hemmed by hand during those lonely evenings after Pa's passing. It all went for a pittance, just enough to buy a ticket west and pack what remained of my past into a single battered trunk. Ma's quilt, pieced together from scraps of our old life, faded calico from her wedding dress, a bit of flannel from my baby blanket, went in last. A warm reminder that I wasn't starting from nothing. As the train rattled out of the station, chugging through snow-swept plains that stretched like an endless white sea, my heart pounded with a mix of terror and exhilaration. What if this Ezekiel was everything his letters promised? What if he wasn't? The questions swirled in my mind like the flakes outside the frost-laced window, but I pushed them down, focusing on the rhythm of the rails carrying me toward something, anything, better than the emptiness I'd left behind. But fate, that cruel jester, had other plans. As the locomotive screeched to a halt in Dusty Hollow, the world exploded into chaos. Shouts pierced the air, gunfire cracking like thunder over the storm. Outlaws, masked shadows on horseback, swarmed the platform, rifles glinting in the dim light. "Hand over the valuables," one bellowed, his voice muffled by a bandana crusted with ice. Panic surged through the passengers. A woman screamed as a bullet shattered a window nearby. My trunk, my lifeline, tumbled from the baggage car in the frenzy. I grabbed what I could, stuffing Ma's quilt under my coat, and bolted into the drifts, heart racing as snow swallowed my footsteps. The outlaws rifled through the cars, but the storm seemed to aid my escape, blinding them as it had me. I crouched behind a stack of crates, breath coming in shallow gasps, praying they wouldn't spot me. Minutes felt like hours until the gunfire faded, replaced by the thud of hooves retreating into the whiteout. When I emerged, shaking and soaked, the platform was a wreck, scattered luggage, a wounded conductor groaning for help. My trunk was gone, vanished with the bandits, or buried under fresh snow. All I had left was the letter in my pocket and the quilt pressing against my chest like a second skin. Left alone on that windswept platform, my breath fogging the frigid air, I scanned the empty road for any sign of Ezekiel. My shawl whipped wildly as the storm intensified, turning the world into a swirling white void where up and down blurred into nothingness. The cold clawed at me, seeping through my boots and numbing my toes, but I stood firm, whispering to myself, "You've faced worse, Amelia. This ain't the end." Minutes stretched into an eternity, 10, then 20, then more, as I fought the biting wind, my fingers turning to ice in my gloves. Was this fate's cruel joke? Had Ezekiel changed his mind, or worse, been caught in the ambush? Doubt crept in like frostbite, slow and insidious, making me question every word in those letters. What if I'd been a fool to come here, chasing a dream scribbled by a stranger? Through the curtain of snow, a broad-shouldered figure finally emerged, clad in a weathered coat dusted with white and a hat pulled low against the gale. Ezekiel Hayes. At least I assumed it was him, though his face was as hard as granite, no spark of recognition or joy in his eyes. He trudged forward, his boots sinking deep, and stopped a few feet away. No smile cracked his chapped lips, no warm embrace for the woman who'd crossed half a continent on his word. He just nodded curtly, muttering something about the wagon being hitched nearby, his gaze avoiding mine like I was a ghost he didn't want to acknowledge. My spirit sank like lead in my chest, the hope I'd nurtured flickering like a candle in the wind. "Mr. Hayes?" I ventured, my voice barely audible over the howl. He grunted in affirmation, turning on his heel without another word. I followed, my skirts heavy with snow, each step a battle against the storm and the growing ache in my heart. The ride to his ranch was silent torture, the wagon creaking over frozen ruts while the blizzard raged on. Ezekiel gripped the reins with white-knuckled hands, his broad frame hunched against the cold. I stole glances at him, rugged jaw set firm, eyes shadowed under his hat's brim, and wondered what lay beneath that stoic exterior. His letters had been full of warmth, tales of sunsets over the plains and dreams of a family to fill the empty rooms. But here in the flesh he was a wall of silence, the kind that made a woman feel small, even when she knew she wasn't. By the time we reached the ranch, a sturdy log cabin hunkered against a stand of skeletal pines, my fingers were numb, and my hopes even more so. Behind the barn, where the wind whistled through cracks in the wood, Ezekiel finally spoke the words that sliced through me like a knife honed sharp. He turned to me, his breath clouding the air, and said, "You're not what I pictured. Too sturdy, not dainty enough for this life." The rejection hung heavy in the frosty air, each syllable a blow to the fragile bridge I'd built between us. I stood there, stunned, feeling the world tilt. Not dainty? I'd crossed mountains and storms for him, sold my soul's worth for a chance at belonging. Tears pricked my eyes, but I blinked them back, refusing to let him see me break. "I see," I whispered, my voice steady despite the storm inside. Without a fight, without begging, I turned away, boots crunching through the fresh snow, my shawl fluttering like a flag of surrender as I headed back toward the station. No plan, no destination, just the raw instinct for survival pushing me forward, one frozen step at a time. Tears froze on my cheeks as I trudged on, a quiet unraveling of all I'd dared to dream. The wind mocked me, whispering failures from my past. The men who'd called me too bold, the city that had chewed me up and spit me out. I sat by the empty tracks, no return ticket in my pocket, no shelter from the relentless storm, just the endless howl of wind that seemed to echo my loneliness. My mind raced with what-ifs. What if I'd stayed in Chicago? What if Ezekiel had been different? The cold seeped into my bones, turning my thoughts sluggish. But deep down, a spark refused to die. Numb as I was, I rose, not from some grand direction, but from the sheer will to keep moving, to prove that rejection wasn't my end. I trudged into Dusty Hollow proper, a ramshackle cluster of wooden shacks and mud-churned streets where hard-faced folks eyed strangers like potential threats. Lamplight flickered from saloons and mercantiles, casting long shadows that danced with the snow. I knocked on the door of the apothecary, a weathered building with a sign creaking in the wind, and begged for shelter. Old Doc Harlan, a grizzled man with spectacles perched on his nose and a perpetual frown, grumbled but let me in. "Got a room upstairs?" he said, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Ain't much. Bare walls, slanted roof, single bed that's seen better days, 2 bits a night, and don't expect breakfast." I handed over my last coins, my hands trembling, and climbed the narrow stairs to my new home. It was cramped and cold, the wind sneaking through gaps in the planks, but it was dry enough to keep the frost at bay. That night, wrapped in Ma's quilt, I wept silently, the fabric absorbing my sorrow like it had so many times before. But even in the darkness, a quiet resolve stirred. I'd rebuild, thread by thread, because out here, survival wasn't given, it was earned. The days that followed were a blur of scraping by. Whispers followed me like shadows. "That's the jilted bride, poor soul, waited in the snow like a fool while Hayes turned tail." I'd catch snippets in the diner or on the boardwalk. "Mrs. Lila Thorne, The baker's wife, with her sharp tongue and sharper eyes, clucking to her cronies about how I was too tall for any decent man. But I held my chin high, refusing to let their words poison me. I took in mending from the townsfolk, miners with torn shirts from the silver claims up the hill, cowboys with ripped chaps from wrangling steers. My needles flew, each stitch a small victory, earning me enough for bread and beans. At the diner, run by a no-nonsense widow named Bessie Grant, I'd trade pies I'd baked in Doc's tiny stove for eggs or a hot meal. Bessie, with her flour-dusted apron and kind but wary eyes, became an unlikely ally. "Don't pay mind to the gossips, girl," she'd say, sliding me an extra slice of cornbread. "This town's full of folks who've been kicked by life. You just keep standing tall." One stormy night, as I sat by the flickering lantern mending a miner's shirt, its fabric rough and stained with ore, a roar like a freight train shook the walls. Flash flood! The river, swollen from melting snow higher up, burst its banks and tore through Dusty Hollow like a vengeful spirit. Water surged into the streets, carrying barrels, wagons, and screams in its wake. I grabbed Ma's quilt and bolted for the door. But the flood slammed against the apothecary, sweeping shelves of bottles and my few possessions into the torrent. Doc Harlan shouted from downstairs, "Amelia, get out!" I waded through knee-deep muck, clinging to the quilt as debris battered my legs. A floating crate nearly knocked me under, but I fought back, gasping as I reached higher ground. The town was a sodden mess by dawn. Homes flooded, livestock lost. Folks huddled in the church with wide-eyed fear. I helped where I could, stitching up wounds and sharing my quilt with a shivering child whose ma wept in gratitude. In the aftermath, as we rebuilt plank by plank, I felt a shift. The whispers softened. Some even nodded in respect. Rejection hadn't broken me. It had tempered me like steel in a forge. Rebuilding from the deluge took weeks, but it drew me into the rhythm of Dusty Hollow. I frequented the general store, the heartbeat of the town, where the air hummed with chatter, the clink of coins and the scent of coffee and leather. Behind the counter stood Samuel Blackwood, tall and steady as an oak, with eyes that held quiet depths like still waters after a storm. He wasn't flashy like the saloon rowdies, those young bucks with their loud laughs and quick draws, but there was a strength in his silence, a gentleness in the way he handled fragile goods. One afternoon, as I bought a spool of thread, he noticed a tattered book peeking from my basket, a romance I'd salvaged from the flood, its pages warped, but words intact. "You fond of readin'?" he asked softly, his voice low and warm like honey over gravel. I looked up, startled, and met his gaze, hazel eyes that seemed to see right through to the ache I'd buried deep. I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips despite myself. Adventures mostly, with happy endings. Helps pass the long nights. He lent me a worn novel wrapped in brown paper. No charge, just bring it back when you're done, Miss Harper. And so our quiet exchanges began, like seeds taking root in parched soil. I'd return the book, and we'd talk. First about the plots, the twists that kept you guessing, then about pies I'd baked or the weather turning foul. Samuel shared snippets of his world, how he'd come to Dusty Hollow after losing his wife to fever 2 years back, leaving him with a hollow in his chest that no amount of work could fill. "She loved stories too," he'd say, his voice catching just a touch, making my heart twist in sympathy. I opened up in turn, not about Ezekiel, that wound was too fresh, but about the loneliness of the city, the dreams that had driven me west. As weeks turned into a tentative rhythm, I found myself visiting the store more often, sometimes for buttons or molasses I didn't truly need, lingering at the counter where Samuel set aside books just for me, tales of bold women forging paths in untamed lands, loves that grew slow and strong like roots through rock. I'd repay with fresh-baked goods, apple turnovers dusted with cinnamon, or hand-sewn pouches filled with dried herbs from Doc's garden. It was a gentle give and take, building like a sturdy fence against the wild unknowns of this frontier life. One crisp morning, with the first hints of thaw in the air, I brought him a scarf I'd knit from soft wool traded at the diner. "Kindness ain't measured, Mr. Blackwood," I said, placing it on the counter with hands that trembled just a bit. Samuel's gaze lingered, those hazel eyes reading between my lines, seeing the vulnerability I tried to hide. "Call me Samuel, Amelia," he replied, his fingers brushing mine as he took the scarf. In that touch, something sparked, a warmth that chased away the chill I'd carried since that fateful platform. Our talks grew intimate, weaving through shared losses that bound us in mutual healing. Samuel spoke of his wife's laugh, how it echoed in the empty store some nights, and I confessed the sting of Ezekiel's words, how they'd made me doubt my worth. "You're more than enough," he'd say, his voice steady, igniting a flicker of belief in my chest. But even as this budding connection pulled me from the brink, shadows loomed. Ezekiel's jealous glares when he passed the store, whispers of outlaws circling back for unfinished business. Little did I know, the real storm was just brewing, one that would test not just my heart, but the fragile threads tying me to this new life. The flood had washed away more than belongings. It unearthed old grudges in Dusty Hollow. Ezekiel